I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and to the Greek. I'm Chad Davis, and this is Romans 1:16 Radio.
When this book begins, we are in approximately 605 BC, and we read this. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. So verse 1 is history. And verse 2 is also, but verse 2 is theology. It's a matter of historical record that Nebuchadnezzar, on his way down to Egypt, conquers Jerusalem, and Jehoiakim surrenders to him. That's history. But here's the theology. Verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, the king of Judah, into his hand. See the difference? That's like saying Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem. What is that? Is that history? Yes. Verifiable history. But when we say Jesus was crucified outside Jerusalem for our sins, now we've crossed over into theology.
Okay.
Now there is a spiritual understanding of the events that actually happened in the world. An outsider might not think that the Lord handed Jehoiakim over to Nebuchadnezzar or handed Jerusalem over to the Babylonians, but the writer understands it as the work of God. Now we haven't in here, but if we read the prophets that came before Daniel, we'd know this was coming. Right? Because the prophets warned the kings, and they told the kings, they said, if you don't repent, you can go back even to Moses, and the warning is there that if you don't keep my statutes and obey my commandments, you'll be banished from the land, and you'll be scattered. And that's exactly what's happened here. But Daniel opens up the curtain to this grand scene, and we're not at war anymore. We're not in Jerusalem anymore. Daniel's whole life, from the time this book opens forward, is lived in Babylon. So we're told, tell the chief eunuch, bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish, of good appearance. Okay, so he was of royal heritage. He was a youth, I'm guessing 12, 13 years old. And if you remember Isaiah 39, the verse is 7, where it's prophesied. Let me see if I can just pull that up real quick. Where it's prophesied that this was going to happen. Then we're going to have a shocking realization about Daniel when we hear this verse. Isaiah 39:7 says, and some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. And the Lord said through the prophet Isaiah to King Hezekiah, some of your descendants are going to be eunuchs in the court of the king of Babylon. Who's in charge of Daniel and his friends? The chief of the eunuchs. Sure. Now, Denise, you've hit on the theme of the whole book of Daniel. The theme of the whole book of Daniel is that God is in control. Even if it doesn't look like it, even if you're off in Babylon in captivity, you have hit on the theme already. But the person who's responsible for feeding them and mentoring them and training them is this gentleman named Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch. So the question is Daniel a eunuch? And do we know what a eunuch is? Okay. I believe Daniel's a eunuch. I believe that when Nebuchadnezzar first conquered Jerusalem, he took away some of the nobility, some of these handsome children, and they were kept as a form of a hostage. Yes, and they were castrated. became eunuchs. But here's the thing. Here's how I demonstrate my dominance as the king of the whole world over your puny kingdom, Jerusalem. I've got your grandson serving in my palace, and he's a eunuch. But Daniel is one of the few, if not the only one, who no one in any page of Scripture ever criticizes Daniel. He's never accused of sin. We know he had it, but we are never shown anything but a positive example. An excellent spirit. And he is highly favored. And that is a good thing. So that's where we are with Daniel. And that brings us to something I'd like to do every week, and that is the Hebrew word of the day. I don't want to teach you biblical Hebrew. I think that's probably beyond my capabilities anyway, and would take me a year and a half or 2 years to do so. But sometimes it's good we can learn something from a word in the original language. And the name Daniel is our Hebrew word for the day, and it's spelled Daniel, and it means literally one of two things. I'll lean toward the second. The first, a lot of the books are going to tell you it means God is my judge. But when I look at this, it looks like a Hebrew construct, meaning a judge who belongs to God. So God's judge, as in the judge that God sends. Now, definitively, I can't say for sure that it's one way or the other, but the word Dan means God, and Dan means judge, and the word El means God, and the way that they're put together with a little sere vowel there makes me think it's a Hebrew construct, and so it's a possessive, God's judge, the judge belonging to or last week we talked about the Assyrian methodology for conquest was they would intermarry people. So when they come down into what is in the New Testament called Samaria, it was northern Israel, they hauled off a lot of able-bodied men and they intermarried them someplace else. Some people think it's up around the Caspian Sea, and there's a lot of evidence that maybe the lost 10 tribes are not really lost, they're up that way. But the Assyrians intermarry people so that in a generation or two, they lose their identity as Israelites or as Edomites, and they begin to identify as Assyrian. But the idea in the Assyrian conquest, which was 120 years before, was to break down the national identity. The ideology of the Babylonians was different. They wanted to get your money. They wanted you to pay tribute. They wanted to kill the people that would fight against them in war. And they wanted to bring the best and the brightest, the most talented, the handsomest, best looking, how they described, youth without blemish, of good appearance, skillful in wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, and learning, competent to improve Babylon. Because Nebuchadnezzar saw his kingdom and his city as this great pinnacle of civilization. The world had never been as advanced or as rich or as powerful and influential as Babylon, in Nebuchadnezzar's opinion. And so if I can find the very, very best out of this city and the very, very best out of that city and the very, very best out of this city, I'll take my Assyrians, I'll take my Egyptians, I'll take them from all of the neighboring kingdoms, and I want some of those folks from Judea, and we're going to get their gold and their silver and their precious items from their temple and bring it all here to me, and I'll sit on it, and I'll be king of the best kingdom anywhere. But now that he has them there, they cannot be Judeans or whatever he might have called them. They need to become Babylonians. Let's take that left turn and talk about world order. This is a theme in the book of Daniel. Prior to the Assyrian Empire, there were kingdoms, and they were local kingdoms. And Egypt was a really big one, but it still was never a global, a world kingdom. But Assyria had enough power to make every known kingdom bow down and pay tribute. Wow. And after that, Babylon. And we'll see that there are a few more after that as we get through the book of Daniel. World empire has just come on the historical scene. By the time we get to the Roman Empire, they have control all the way up to Hadrian's Wall in the very north of England, the little boundary where Scotland begins. And the only reason there's an England and a Scotland and they're separate places is because that's as far as the Romans could get. That's where they stopped. And they had command over all of the known civilized world at the time. Now I realize at the time they didn't know the world was round. There were continents they didn't know existed, but everything they knew about, they had command of. And so they said the whole world. And this is what Nebuchadnezzar has in view, that he is a world ruler, not a local ruler. Okay? And so he wants to bring everything under his subjection, including the gods of those foreign nations, which just so happens to include the one true God. So let's get to the naming. He wants to assimilate these Hebrew children, as they're called, into his court to make them good Babylonians. Yeah, they might be held in hostage, but the real goal is to make Babylon better than it was. And so they are named, king doesn't name them, Ashpenaz names them. They are named Babylonian names. They are taught Babylonian language, yes sir, Babylonian literature, Babylonian everything. And they became very skilled at it, and Daniel had a special gift, visions and dreams. So let's talk about these names. Daniel, as we said, our Hebrew word of the day, Daniel, he's called Belteshazzar, where his name meant God's judge, or God is my judge. Now his name means may Bel preserve his life. Who, pray tell, is Bel? He's a Babylonian god. Now, we could go on a long rabbit trail and talk about each of these Babylonian gods. Suffice it to say, Bel is a very important deity in the pantheon, the polytheistic Babylonian religion. Hananiah, his Hebrew name means compassion of God, or God has been compassionate to me. But his name is changed to Shadrach, meaning commanded by Aku. Again, Aku is another god. Now, is that a problem? You would think so. And we're gonna see how Daniel and the Hebrew boys negotiate being in a foreign culture and yet believing in the one true God. Mishael's name meant who is like God. Again, you see the L on the end, just like Daniel. Mishael, who is like God. And his name is changed to Meshach, which means who is like Shach. Azariah, whose Hebrew name means God has helped me, his name is changed to Abednego, which is the servant of Nego. So they all get named after Babylonian gods. I think, that's just my opinion, that Nebuchadnezzar's plan is that they will forget the Hebrew God and they will become Babylonian worshipers. Doesn't happen, as we find out in chapter 3. Right? We find out in bold color in a famous story. Doesn't happen in chapter 3. So the stage is set for these, I'm just going to call them 13-year-old boys, to completely lose contact with their heritage in Jerusalem, with their identity as the people of Israel, with the God of Israel, and just be assimilated into Babylonian culture and religion. The stage is set. And imagine if you're in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar, knowing full well that most of the boys who were imported from Babylon are out working in a field somewhere, or out building a building somewhere. They're eating whatever they happen to get, and you get offered pork chops and lobster. I chose those two things because they're not kosher, and they're pretty tasty. Right?
Yes, sir.
Because these boys were not just given food to subsist, they were given food from Nebuchadnezzar's table. In fact, it says it's the food that he eats. Yeah, it says he eats it. The king assigned him a daily portion of the food that the king ate and the wine that he drank. Now, we know it took God's intervention, but Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they did not eat that food. Okay? There are dietary laws in the Torah, the law of Moses, that specifically say you can't eat hyrax, camel, roebuck, rabbit, pork. Okay? And there's some more. And you can't eat anything that swims in the ocean unless it has fins and scales. And then beyond what specific animals that the Jews are not allowed to eat, there's also some considerations about how the animal is killed. You can't eat animal that's been strangled. You can't eat flesh from a living animal. Do Daniel and his friends know how the animals are killed? Not really. Probably not. It probably gets served to them on a plate or in a bowl, right? Or on a skewer. Here you go. Here, right, fresh off the rotisserie, and they look and they go, I don't know what that is. I don't know. Would I violate the law of God? Now, I think this is more than boys trying to keep kosher, especially because of the wine. There's nothing about the wine that's against the kashrut laws. But they chose not to eat these delicacies, and the reason, we'll get theological finally. How long are we in? It's 10 minutes to 7. We'll get theological because in verse 8 it says, Daniel resolved that he would not defile himself with the king's food or with the wine that he drank. What does it mean to be defiled? So God intended that Israel would be separate from the nations. Okay? Is there anything inherently morally wrong with mixing two kinds of fabric to make your shirt? No, but there's a law against it because Israel was supposed to be visibly different. We're going to be one people who are different. We're not going to intermix. Don't you go marrying those pretty girls from those other nations. And don't you plant more than one kind of crop in your field. That field is a representation of Israel, that Israel is separate to the Lord. Okay? This is a concept that's hard for Christians to grasp because, well, we don't do it, for one. And two, we've taken the word holy and made it mean something else. The word holy does, in fact, have connotations of being sinless. But that's not really where the word comes from. It means to be separated for a specific purpose. The word sanctify comes closer in meaning. If you're sanctified, it means you're set apart from others for a specific purpose. So, Sweet Megan and I got married, and one of the things that we did at our wedding was we celebrated the Lord's Supper together for the first time as a family. And her wedding gift to me was a pottery chalice and paten, the communion ware. And if you were at my wedding, and you would have seen that we all shared the bread that we dipped in the cup, and it was for a holy purpose. It was only for the purpose of Holy Communion, and probably only for that time. Now, what if you came to see me later in my office, and I had pens and pencils and highlighters sticking out of the top of that chalice? You say, hey, Chaplain, isn't that the chalice from your wedding? I said, oh, yeah. And you just go, wow, he's keeping pens and pencils in that. What if I was drinking Coke out of it? What if I was chewing tobacco and spitting my spit into... See, it starts to get offensive when you use something that's supposed to be holy, as in set apart for a specific purpose, and you start to make it a common thing, and you can use it for whatever. Are you hearing me? I can't say that it was just about them keeping kosher. It's that they did not want to be assimilated into this pagan culture any more than they had to. When they said Belteshazzar, he had to come running. He couldn't say, excuse me, my name is Daniel. Right? He couldn't say, Bel is no God at all. Bel is an idol. I worship the one true God. No, he's a servant in the courtyard of the court of this king, and it would cost him his life if he pushed back that hard. So he quietly asked the chief eunuch, could I not eat this? Could we not eat this? Could we just eat vegetables and drink water? And it says here in the text, God gave Daniel favor and compassion in the sight of the chief of the eunuchs. And we know that if you're not eating meat and if you're not drinking wine, you're eating broccoli and water, you probably will look a little puny after 10 days, but they didn't. They looked better. In fact, fatter of flesh. I love that. Kind of wish I wasn't fatter of flesh, but I like the way that said. It's really clear that they were flourishing. Are you going to flourish if you make sure that you stay holy unto the Lord? I believe you are. And I believe you can in the midst of the unbelieving culture. But you can maintain your sanctified status holy unto the Lord in a foreign land. Despite the depressing reality that they're there because of the judgment of God. In fact, you don't read about any faithful Hebrews for quite a while in 2 Kings. You don't hear much good news about how Israel's faithful in the prophets until you open the book of Daniel. And a page is turned, and here are 4 young men who don't want to defile themselves and lose the connection that they have with the God of Israel. They want to maintain, even quietly, their identity as Israel. It was God's will. And that's why Ashpenaz didn't say, forget that noise, you're going to eat what I put in front of you. Do you realize how audacious it is to be in the king's palace, to be specially selected, to be trained, to be educated, to be fed delicacies, and then you go, is it okay if I just eat carrots and drink water? I think refusing the pork chops and the lobster is a life or death situation. I think it is. But we definitely get into a life or death situation when we're told, if you don't worship this statue, I'm going to throw you in a fiery furnace. Okay, so we'll revisit that idea. But I want to address what Menda was talking about. Were they saved through the law? My reading of the New Testament and the Old is that faith came before the law, and that no one was ever saved by observing the law. They were saved by faith as demonstrated in their works, just like now. Just like now. Okay, so if a person's truly saved, they're saved unto good works. It wasn't just the robotic observance of this statute and this commandment. It was the belief that this is what pleases God, and so I'm going to do it. It is faith in God that saved throughout all time, because even though Messiah had not come and Jesus had not made atonement, Abraham believed God. No, you're dead right. You're exactly right. Abraham believed God, and it was accounted to him as righteousness. This is how salvation has always worked. The economy of salvation has been understood differently across the ages. Yes, Menda, we understand it much differently in the New Testament era. But it was always faith and never keeping a list of commandments or not keeping them. The motivation for keeping commandments is that we love God with our heart, with our soul, and with our strength. The motivation isn't fear that we'll be destroyed and we might be. But fear is not the motivation. That doesn't please God. It's not because it's the community standard or the expectation of our parents. It's because we love God and we want to please God. And that's faith. Well, you know, they're walking around being called by the names of foreign gods. They had to capitulate to the society to some degree. But when it came down to their diet, Daniel saw an opportunity to maintain his identity as a Hebrew, as a believer in the God of Israel, as a son of the royal family in Judah. And maybe he's Hezekiah's great-great-grandson, I don't know. But he did not want to just lose his faith and become pure Babylonian. And that was the Babylonian program. If he ate the food, let's just go with it would be a sin. Right. And in fact, he tells the chief eunuch, examine us in 10 days. And if we don't look as good as the other boys, no problem. we will eat the shellfish, right? We will eat what you put before us. We'll eat the delicacies. But his goal is counter to Nebuchadnezzar's goal that they should be assimilated. Now, if you look at 20th century history and 19th century history, and you look at Israel and all of the travails that they've been through, the cultures around them wanted them to stop being so distinctively Jewish and just be Spaniards, for crying out loud. They wanted them to lose their identity and their religion and just become Catholics in Spain. And that's just one example. The pressure on God's people to lose the distinctiveness of being set apart, a holy nation for God, is enormous, because the world does not want to look like a bunch of pagan outsiders, because Israel's got this wonderful relationship with the only real God there is. And they say, oh, well, let's downplay that. You know, when we hear this in our culture today, I really don't want to go to application for 10 more minutes, but I'm gonna. Well, could you just tone down that anti this or that rhetoric, please, church? Could you please allow our particular sin to be acceptable in your community? Don't you think your values are outdated? Don't you have a Bronze Age God and a Bronze Age Bible? And come on. Could you please back off your high horse and stop judging all of us and just get on the program with what this culture wants? The pressure is tremendous.
Yes.
Because if you're holy, and I'm going to use that word, if you're set apart for God, it shows. Now, it happens to benefit Daniel all through his life. And that is really one of the big messages, that it might be hard, it might be unpopular, but goodness, it is in your favor to be set apart for the Lord. But who gets the credit? Is this Daniel and his genius? No. God gave him the favor. And God that worked the miracle that they ate nothing but celery and drank water, and they looked healthier than these other boys. Right? Okay, so what are Daniel's faults and sins here? Daniel's like the first person in the Bible. Even Job loses his cool. Right? Yeah. Even Job gets to the point of being frustrated with God and asking God to give him an explanation. Job's far better man than Chad Davis. But Daniel, we don't find any character flaws. We don't see any mistakes. Daniel is an example of what Israel was supposed to be, and now in Babylon, finally, they are. This is exactly what God had wanted, and Daniel is an icon, if you will, an example, if you will. So verse 21 tells us how long Daniel's ministry was. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. So that is 539 BC. So that's what? 61 plus 6, that's 66 years. 66 years Daniel is in the court of the king. But jumping ahead to chapter 10, could you read chapter 10, verse 1 for us, please? Jumping ahead to chapter 10, we read something else. So even though chapter 1 says he was there until the first year of King Cyrus, chapter 10, verse 1 says, in the third year of King Cyrus, the word of God came to Daniel. So my understanding, my best guess, and that's what it is Daniel served in the court of the kings until the first year of King Cyrus. But he was still in Babylon. Maybe he was retired. 60-something years, and he was probably 13 when he got there. So let's just go with he's 79 years old. I know. And there's something significant about 70 years, isn't there, Denise? Mm-hmm. So here we have Daniel, who stays at least 68 years in Babylon. That is the duration of his ministry. He starts out as a teenager or a pre-teenager, what the Bible calls a youth, and he is still there 66, 68 years later in Babylon. And that it is a long time. So now we know what the text of Daniel chapter 1 says. And this is probably, with 15 or 20 minutes left, this is probably just an exercise in teaching the method that I like to use. Now that we know what the text says, now we want to look at what does the text mean. Okay? This one's not hard. This text is not hard, and we've really covered that already. But who is this text written to? I can't prove it. It's just a guess. Chapter 1 is what you call a prologue. Okay? That's what you call a prologue. It's an introduction to the scene that you need to understand before you get into the real book. Now, it's already telling the message that God's in control. It's already telling the message that you can be faithful despite persecution, despite the many trials. That Daniel's first trial is, what's for dinner? I know Daniel wrote chapter 8 through chapter 12. It says so many times. I'm sure Daniel wrote chapter 2 through chapter 7. Chapter 1, however, I don't think he wrote it when he was 13. If he wrote it, I don't think he wrote it when he was 13, and I'm not sure that he did. This may have been somebody who wrote this to introduce what I think are the two books of the book of Daniel. Chapter 2, verse 4 through chapter 7, verse 28 is what I'm calling Daniel in the court of kings. It doesn't really talk about Israel, not much at all, and it is written in Aramaic, the language of the Babylonians, Chaldean, and it is written, I believe, as a record of the work that he did when he worked in the court of these kings. When he worked in the court of Nebuchadnezzar, Nabonidus, Belshazzar, Darius, and Cyrus. When he was an employee of the royal household, he worked, and I believe that chapters 2 through 7, which are written in Aramaic, we'll prove it next week, those are for them, and then chapter 8 through 12 is for Israel. And the angel Gabriel says, 70 weeks are decreed for your people. We think that this is for Israel. So I think that the introduction is for Israel too. I think that if we had to choose an original audience, it's Israel. Maybe it's an Israel who's coming back out of captivity. Maybe it's an Israel at the end of the exile, and this is a record, a historical record of what happened when we were in exile. And maybe it's Daniel someplace along the line, and he decides he's going to put his two books together. I don't know. But who it's written to is important for understanding it. Okay? And then, when was it written? There's two theories. The one I just gave you, I think, kind of stinks. There's no way to prove it. Right? The main theory is Daniel wrote it, and he wrote it chronologically. Now, the whole chronology of writing this book from front to back doesn't work well because he backtracks. When you get to chapter 8, he backtracks to the reign of Belshazzar, which is quite a few years before. But I think that division is on purpose because of who the audiences are and what the language he's writing in is. But the main theory is Daniel wrote the whole book. Daniel wrote the whole book. Daniel wrote the whole book. I think Daniel wrote the whole book, but he may have written chapter 1 as he was putting it together. Right? So I read it. Used to write plays back when I thought that maybe I could write plays, and I had a book called The Playwright's Handbook, and it said write the last scene first. So you know where your play is going, what the trajectory of the plot is. Write the last scene first. You know, a lot of people in leadership, in the schools of leadership, they say, begin with the end in mind. Okay. Well, Daniel may have, after having written down all of his oracles and all of the history of all the trials, he may have come back and written this chapter as an introduction. But it certainly belongs to the whole of the book. What do you think it meant to Israel during the context of exile? If it was written in exile, what would it have meant to them at that time? Okay, because if you're currently in the trial, if you're currently in exile, and you read the story of the Hebrew children and how they didn't want to eat the meat and they didn't want to drink the wine, it's supposed to, I think, inspire hope, faithfulness, a reminder that, hey, even though we're here, don't let yourself be defiled. Right? Yes. You don't have to give in to all of the ways of the people around you. That would have been, what do you think it might have meant to Israel after the exile? if it was written toward the end of the exile, as they're going back and Nehemiah's building the wall and people are caravanning back to Judea and to Jerusalem, what do you think this might have meant to them then? This is the story of our faithfulness when we were in exile and being punished by God. This is a reminder for us not to repeat the sins of our fathers, but to be faithful like Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and the other guy, Mishael. Right? That this is a reminder that even in the worst of times, even little boys can get this right and please God. And now that we're back in the land of Israel, let us be faithful like Daniel. Let us be faithful like those Hebrew boys. So understanding who the audience is and what time period it is, it's going to shape what the original meaning is. And I think either one of those original meanings is just fine. So that leads us now then to, what would it mean for us now? This is the method. After we've read what the text says and what the text means to the original audience, we have to ask ourselves, when I get up and leave this Bible study, will I be different? Isn't it easy to be a Christian when you're in a room full of Christians? Yeah, it's kind of expected, right? We kind of expect you to act like a Christian when you're here. But then when you get to the workplace and you're the only Christian in the place, and the music's offensive to God, and the jokes are offensive to God, and many things are inconsistent with your Christian walk, how will you keep from being defiled? You know, if you're the only Christian, and it's not a welcome message, God still sees you. You know? God still sees you. God still is dialed into what is going on in your heart and your spirit. And God has expectations that we will be holy, that we are set apart for Him, that we are a holy nation, a chosen people. And we represent God even silently. Now, I do believe you need to preach the gospel wherever you go. I do believe that. But sometimes the right answer is to quietly not eat the food. So I ask what it means to us now. I'm going to ask this question probably every time. This is not a particularly challenging, theologically challenging or controversial chapter of the Bible. But how does what we've studied change our theology at any point? Like, did we believe something when we walked in that now, having read this text, we have to reevaluate? Do we learn anything lasting from the text? Finally, the last thing I want to ask, and we're right at about time here, what are the moral and ethical, spiritual lessons from Daniel chapter 1? That's right. It's not about being a stick in the mud. It's about knowing what's right and continuing to do what's right, even under pressure. Even if it's unpopular, even in a foreign land. You know what they say? What happens in Vegas stays in Vegas? Not true. Right? If you go out there and you get filth on yourself, you are a filthy person, and you take that way. It's on your soul. And you know, I guess Daniel could say, hey, what happens in Babylon stays in Babylon. You know, I guess I got to eat this stuff. I guess I got to worship these gods. I guess I got to bow down before them instead of the God of heaven. Who's going to know? You know, the whole thing didn't work out down there in Judea anyway. I may as well just get on the program with everybody else. But he doesn't. Because what happens in Vegas doesn't stay in Vegas. And Daniel remained true to his God. If you weren't here last week, I'll say this again. When I preach from the pulpit, I preach to convince. In fact, I preach to provoke, convict, and convince in that order. Because I got to wake up sleepy Christians, make sure they understand I'm talking about them, and then convince them to change. That is I am trying to get you to change in that room. In this room, it's a completely different relationship. We're exploring the Bible together. I have an opinion. You have an opinion. I've been studying the Bible my whole life. You've been studying the Bible your whole life. And I don't have to be right, and you don't have to agree with me in Bible study. Okay? But we do want to walk out of here enriched by one another's understanding and better armed to study the Bible for ourselves. Those are our goals.
Thank you for tuning in to Romans 1:16 Radio.